Jimmy Kimmel opened with his usual brand of humor, but there was something different in his tone tonight. He seemed more aggressive, more pointed in his questions. The trouble began almost immediately when Kimmel made a snide comment about Ford's age, suggesting that the 81-year-old actor should consider retirement rather than continuing to take on action roles. I mean, Harrison, at what point do you look in the mirror and think, maybe it's time to let the younger guys handle the stunts? Kimmel smirked, clearly expecting a laugh from the audience. Instead, he was met with an uncomfortable silence. Ford's expression shifted noticeably. The easygoing demeanor he'd maintained for decades of interviews began to crack. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you implying, Jimmy?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made the studio atmosphere suddenly tense. Kimmel, perhaps misreading the room or simply doubling down on what he thought was good television, pressed further. "I'm just saying, you're not exactly Tom Cruise hanging off buildings anymore. Maybe it's time to accept that Han Solo has flown his last mission." The audience grew increasingly uncomfortable as Ford leaned forward in his chair. "You know, Jimmy, I've been doing this for 50 years. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema history, and I've never had someone question my ability to do my job based on my age in such a disrespectful manner." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed energized by Ford's obvious irritation. "Oh, come on, Harrison, it's just a joke. Can't you take a little ribbing? I thought Indiana Jones was supposed to be tough." That's when things really started to escalate. Ford's famous composure, the same calm demeanor that had made him perfect for playing Han Solo and Indiana Jones, was beginning to show cracks. "A joke?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You invite me onto your show to promote my work, and then you spend the first 5 minutes telling me I'm too old to do what I've been successfully doing longer than you've been alive?" The tension in the studio was palpable now. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly sensing that this wasn't the playful banter they'd come to expect from late-night television. Even the band members seemed to be avoiding eye contact, focusing intently on their instruments as if pretending not to witness the growing confrontation. Kimmel, rather than attempting to diffuse the situation, seemed to interpret Ford's reaction as an opportunity for even better television. "Look, I get it. Nobody likes getting older. But we all have to face reality eventually. Maybe it's time to transition into more age-appropriate roles. You know, the wise mentor, the grandfather figure." Ford's jaw clenched visibly. "Age-appropriate roles? Jimmy, do you realize what you're saying? You're sitting there making assumptions about what I can and cannot do, based entirely on a number. Have you seen my latest film? Have you watched any of the work I've done recently?" "I've seen the trailers," Kimmel replied dismissively, "and honestly, it looks like a lot of CGI doing the heavy lifting." The studio fell completely silent. Even the cameramen seemed frozen, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut away. Ford stared at Kimmel for a long moment, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "So you're criticizing work you haven't even bothered to watch," Ford said slowly, his voice now carrying a dangerous quiet intensity. "You invite me here presumably to discuss my career and my current project, but you've already made up your mind about both based on what exactly? My birth certificate?" Kimmel, perhaps realizing he'd pushed too far but unable to back down gracefully, attempted to pivot with humor. "Hey, I'm just looking out for you, Harrison. I don't want to see you get hurt doing something you're not up for anymore." But Ford had clearly reached his limit. He stood up abruptly, causing his microphone to feedback slightly through the speakers. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, and suddenly everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Not up for?" Ford's voice was now clearly audible throughout the studio without the microphone. "Jimmy, I've been acting professionally since before you were born. I've worked with Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas. I've created characters that will outlive both of us. And you're sitting there telling me what I am and am not capable of." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel it. This wasn't scripted banter or playful celebrity roasting. This was a genuine conflict between two very different philosophies about respect, professionalism, and the treatment of veteran performers in Hollywood. Ford's anger was building to something that would change late-night television. Kimmel, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation he'd created, continued his attack with a condescending laugh. "Harrison, you're getting way too worked up over this. It's comedy, remember? This is a comedy show." He gestured dismissively toward the audience as if seeking their support. But the crowd remained uncomfortably silent. Ford's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the host still seated behind his desk. "Comedy? You think ageism is funny, Jimmy? You think diminishing someone's life's work is entertainment?" His voice carried the weight of decades in an industry that had often discarded talent the moment it was deemed past its prime. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings," Kimmel replied, his tone patronizing rather than apologetic. "But let's be honest here. You're not the action star you used to be. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." The studio's atmosphere grew even more electric. Ford took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence suddenly commanding the entire space in a way that reminded everyone why he'd been such a compelling screen presence for so many years. "Everyone's thinking? Or just you, Jimmy? Because from where I'm standing it sounds like you're projecting your own insecurities about aging onto me." Kimmel's expression shifted, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face for the first time. "My insecurities? I'm not the one clinging to roles I'm too old for. I'm not the one pretending I can still be an action hero when I should be playing somebody's grandfather." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ford stood completely still for a moment, his jaw working as he processed what had just been said. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Clinging to roles? Jimmy, I've earned every role I've ever played. I've put in the work, I've taken the risks, and I've delivered performances that have entertained millions of people for generations." "Yeah, well, that was then," Kimmel shot back, now fully committed to this destructive path. "This is now, and now you look ridiculous, trying to be something you're not anymore." The audience began to murmur among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this interview had taken. Some were pulling out their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford's publicist, visible in the wings, was frantically gesturing to the show's producers, but no one seemed willing to intervene. "Something I'm not anymore?" Ford repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "Jimmy, I just completed a film where I performed 90% of my own stunts. I trained for months. I worked 16-hour days, and I delivered exactly what was asked of me. But you wouldn't know that because, by your own admission, you haven't bothered to watch the work you're criticizing." Kimmel leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face. "I don't need to watch it to know what it is. It's a desperate attempt to recapture your glory days, propped up by special effects and stunt doubles, marketed to audiences who remember when you were actually relevant." The words hit like a physical blow. Ford's hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment it looked like he might actually lose his legendary composure entirely. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance of what was becoming a career-defining moment for both men, though neither yet realized just how far-reaching the consequences would be. "Desperate?" Ford's voice was now clearly audible throughout the studio. "The only thing desperate here is a talk show host so insecure about his own relevance that he has to tear down a guest to feel important." The observation was delivered with surgical precision, cutting straight to the heart of what many had suspected about Kimmel's increasingly aggressive interview style. Kimmel's face flushed red. "Insecure? I'm not the one having a meltdown on live television because someone pointed out the obvious truth about my career." The host stood up from behind his desk, matching Ford's standing position in what felt like a face-off. "The obvious truth?" Ford stepped closer, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. The obvious truth is that you've forgotten what this business is supposed to be about. It's not about tearing people down for cheap laughs. It's not about making guests feel unwelcome in your own studio. The tension between the two men was now so thick, it seemed to affect everyone in the room. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what felt like a masterclass in how not to conduct a professional interview. Behind the cameras, crew members exchanged worried glances, unsure whether they should continue filming or find a way to end this disaster. But Ford wasn't finished. Years of maintaining diplomatic composure in countless interviews, years of playing the game and being the consummate professional, seemed to be culminating in this moment of absolute honesty. "You know what the real problem is here, Jimmy?" Kimmel crossed his arms defensively, but his body language betrayed his discomfort. "Enlighten me, Harrison. What's my problem?" Ford's voice dropped to a level that somehow made it even more commanding. "Your problem is that you've confused cruelty with comedy. You think being mean-spirited makes you edgy, but it just makes you small." The observation landed with devastating accuracy, and even Kimmel seemed momentarily stunned by its directness. "I'm not being cruel," Kimmel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm being honest. Someone needs to tell you that your time is over." "My time is over?" Ford laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jimmy, I've been in this business for 5 decades. I've survived studio politics, changing trends, and countless people like you who thought they could define my worth. And here I am, still working, still creating, still challenging myself. Where will you be in 10 years when the next generation of talk show hosts decides you're past your prime?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kimmel's face grew redder, and his usual quick wit seemed to abandon him. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" Ford pressed forward relentlessly. "You're sitting there judging me based on my age, dismissing my work without even watching it, and treating me like I'm some relic who should be grateful for your attention. But the truth is, you're terrified of getting older yourself. You're terrified that someday you'll be sitting in my chair, having some younger host tell you that your time is up." The studio had become completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. Even the usually restless audience sat transfixed by this psychological dissection playing out before them. Ford had turned the tables completely, transforming from victim to prosecutor in a matter of moments. Kimmel tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You're completely overreacting to some harmless jokes." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the impact of Ford's words. "Harmless?" Ford's voice rose again. "Jimmy, do you have any idea how many talented actors have been pushed out of this industry because people like you convinced audiences they were too old, too irrelevant, too past their prime? Do you understand the damage that kind of thinking does?" "I'm not responsible for ageism in Hollywood," Kimmel shot back, but he was clearly on the defensive now. "No, but you're perpetuating it," Ford replied immediately. "You're using your platform to reinforce the idea that talent has an expiration date, that experience is worthless, that anyone over a certain age should just disappear quietly. And you're doing it for cheap laughs from an audience that deserves better." The accusation seemed to hit Kimmel particularly hard. He glanced toward the audience, perhaps looking for support, but found only uncomfortable faces staring back at him. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that he was losing this battle badly. "Look, Harrison, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," Kimmel attempted, his tone shifting toward something resembling conciliation. "Why don't we start over?" But Ford was having none of it. "Start over? Jimmy, you can't unsay what you've already said. You can't take back the disrespect you've shown, not just to me, but to every viewer who's ever been made to feel worthless because of their age." The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was becoming not just a personal confrontation, but a broader statement about respect, dignity, and the way society treats its elders. Ford had transformed what started as a petty, insult into something much more significant. "You want to know what's really desperate?" Ford continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and experience. "It's a host who has to tear down his guests to feel powerful. It's someone who mistakes meanness for wit and thinks that hurting people makes him relevant." Kimmel's face was now deep red, and his usual composure had completely evaporated. "You know what? Maybe you should leave if you can't handle a little comedy." "A little comedy?" Ford repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call this?" "Jimmy, I've worked with some of the funniest people in the world. I understand comedy. This isn't comedy. This is just cruelty disguised as entertainment." The confrontation had reached a new level of intensity. Ford's decades of professionalism were warring with his very human need to defend himself and his craft. Kimmel, meanwhile, seemed trapped between his desire to maintain control of his own show and his growing realization that he had badly miscalculated this entire interaction. "Fine," Kimmel said, his voice tight with anger. "If you don't like how I run my show, maybe you shouldn't have come on it." Ford stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried absolute finality. "You're absolutely right, Jimmy. I shouldn't have come on a show hosted by someone who has so little respect for his guests." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent studio, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Ford's decision was made, and nothing Kimmel could say now would change what was about to happen. Ford began removing his microphone with deliberate, controlled movements, each action weighted with finality. The small clip-on device seemed to take forever to detach, and the silence stretched on as the entire studio watched. This legendary actor prepared to do something unprecedented in his 5-decade career. "Harrison, wait!" Kimmel called out, perhaps finally recognizing the magnitude of what was happening. "Let's just calm down and talk about this like adults." Ford paused in his microphone removal and looked directly at Kimmel with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and pity. "Adults? Jimmy, adults don't ambush their guests with personal attacks. Adults don't use their platform to demean people who've shown them nothing but respect. Adults certainly don't double down on cruelty when they're called out on it." The microphone finally came free, and Ford placed it carefully on the small table beside his chair. The gesture was performed with the same methodical precision he'd brought to countless film performances, but now it carried the weight of a career-defining moment. "You know what the saddest part of all this is?" Ford continued, his voice now carrying clearly throughout the studio without amplification. "I came here tonight genuinely excited to talk about my work, to share stories with your audience, to connect with people who might enjoy what I've created. Instead, I've been treated like a burden, like some has-been who should be grateful for the scraps of attention you're willing to throw my way." Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, clearly struggling to find words that could somehow salvage this disaster. "Harrison, Look, maybe I came on too strong with the jokes, but that's just my style. Ask anyone." "Your style?" Ford's eyebrows raised in genuine disbelief. "Jimmy, your style is the problem. When did we decide that being a good host meant making guests feel small? When did we agree that entertainment required humiliating people who've accomplished more than most of us could dream of?" The audience began to shift uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement with Ford's words. A few people were openly filming with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become part of television history. Ford turned toward the audience, addressing them directly for the first time. "I want to apologize to all of you. You came here tonight expecting to be entertained, and instead you've had to sit through this uncomfortable display of unprofessionalism. You deserve better than this." The gesture was masterful, transforming Ford from a guest having a breakdown into a seasoned performer, taking control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of hand. Several audience members began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into sustained clapping that filled the studio. Kimmel's face went from red to pale as he watched his own audience respond more warmly to his guest than they had to anything he'd said all evening. "Come on, people, this is getting way out of hand." But Ford wasn't finished. He had decades of pent-up frustration with the way Hollywood treated its veteran performers, and this moment had become his platform to address it all. "You know, Jimmy, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about me being too old for action roles. And you're right about one thing. I am older now. But with that age comes something you clearly haven't developed yet. Wisdom." The observation landed, like a knockout punch. Ford continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Wisdom to understand that talent doesn't have an expiration date. Wisdom to know that experience is valuable, not shameful. And wisdom to recognize when someone is using cruelty as a substitute for actual wit." Kimmel tried once more to regain control. "Look, Harrison, you're making this into something it's not. This is just how late-night television works." "No, Jimmy, this is how your late-night television works," Ford replied firmly. "And that's exactly the problem. You've confused controversy with entertainment, meanness with humor, and disrespect with edginess. But real entertainment doesn't require tearing people down." Ford began walking toward the stage exit, each step measured and deliberate. The cameras followed him, capturing what would become one of the most iconic moments in talk show history. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time. "I've spent 50 years in this business learning one fundamental truth. Respect is earned, but it should also be given freely until someone proves they don't deserve it. Tonight, Jimmy, you've proven you don't deserve it." With that, Ford walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a stunned studio, a humiliated host, and an audience that erupted into the longest, loudest applause in the show's history. Kimmel stood behind his desk, face flushed and speechless, as his production team scrambled to figure out how to fill the remaining airtime. The walkout was captured by dozens of audience members' phones and immediately began spreading across social media. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were trending worldwide, with overwhelming support for Ford's dignified stand against workplace disrespect. Kimmel's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as advertisers distanced themselves from the controversy. The incident became a watershed moment in late-night television, sparking important conversations about ageism, respect, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. Ford's principled stand reminded everyone that true professionalism means treating people with dignity, regardless of their age or status. For Harrison Ford, the walkout became one of his most celebrated moments, proving that sometimes the most powerful performance happens when the cameras aren't rolling for a movie, but when they're capturing real human dignity in action.